At first light, when the mist still clung to the furrows like breath held too long, Caroline Brooks said she saw the corn breathe. Not move, breathe. She said the rose inhaled, a hush pulling inward, silk whispering, and then exhaled with a cold that prickled her arms through her nightdress. She had been standing barefoot on the porch steps, the boards damp with dew, the old spaniel whining low at her ankles. Then the lights came. They were not headlights, not lanterns, not the bleary glow from the single bulb in the barn that liked to flicker when the wind turned mean. These lights rose inside the corn itself, as if the stalks had grown glass bones and filled them with milk-white fire. Pale spheres drifted between leaves, slow as dust motes and deliberate as searchers. One hovered above the scarecrow's burlap jaw and made the stitched grin look wet. Another skimmed the irrigation ditch, casting ripples of light along the water like a shoal of minnows turning in unison. The last one, Caroline swore, pulsed as if it listened. Once, twice, a heartbeat. Then all three slid inward, converging toward the center of the field where the earth dipped and the soil always stayed a touch darker than the rest. "Daddy," she called, and her voice was a small thing that the fog nearly kept. "Daddy, wake up. You have to see this." Inside, the clock over the stove coughed its tick. The kettle, forgotten from last night, rested cold. Daniel Brooks slept in the chair under the window, hat over his eyes, boots still on, too tired to make it the extra 10 steps to his bed. Bills lay face down on the table, corners softened by handling, a pink slip peeking between them like a tongue. The house smelled faintly of soap, old coffee, and the burlap sack of feed he'd dragged in before the rain. It had rained everywhere but here. Storms marched to the horizon, then split around the Brooks place like a river around a stone. Caroline shook his shoulder until the hat slid to the floor. Daniel woke quick, the way men do after too many seasons of bad news. He read his daughter's face, wide eyes that too careful breathing, and he did not ask if she was sure. He stood, joints popping, and took the shotgun because habit is another kind of prayer. The dog, Scout, beat them to the door, then balked at the threshold with a rueful whine like even loyalty had limits. They stepped into a dawn that wasn't dawn, the color leached strange, the sky bruised at its edges. The corn hissed softly, tassels tickling the light breeze. Somewhere, a diesel engine growled awake down County Road 7. Somewhere, a crow cleared its throat. But here, at the Brooks farm, sound seemed to stand back from the field, as if the rose had declared a radius where noise must bow. Caroline touched his sleeve. "There," she whispered. Daniel followed her finger and saw it. A pearled glow threading the leaves not far off. 3 bodies of light swimming inward to a point he could not see. The hairs along his forearms rose not from fear. He'd known fear, the tight dry clamp in the chest when the bank called, but from a recognition he couldn't place, like remembering a melody you heard once in church and can hum, but not name. "Stay on the edge," he told her. "If I say run, you run to the road and don't look back." She nodded, jaw set in a way that made her look like her mother when the tractor sputtered and the sky promised hail. Daniel stepped into the rose. The leaves closed behind him with a wet lace sound. He pressed onward, the earth firm, the dirt cool through the split in his boot. The light ahead dipped, rose, waited. He thought of will-o'-the-wisps from stories his father told, swamps and tricksters and men who walked toward marvels and found only mud. He tightened his grip on the shotgun and parted the next row with his elbow. There, a circle of trampled stalks the size of a horse pen, stems bent clean at their nodes as if someone had creased them with a ruler. In the center, the soil had been turned, not dug, but lifted and set back imperfect, the way a child might pry up a rug corner to hide a coin. And from the seam where earth met earth, a thin line of light leaked. It did not shine outward. It breathed outward, a slow pulse timed to an invisible heart. Daniel knelt. He touched the seam. The light cooled his finger like spring water. The ground beneath him hummed, a faint metallic thrum that reminded him of the grain elevator in town when the belts were good. He swallowed. Behind him, Caroline waited at the edge of the circle, eyes wide, hair damp with mist. "Daddy?" she said again, voice smaller now. "Hush," he said, but not unkind. "There's something under here." The lights gathered, hovering like patient witnesses. Then for the first and only time, Daniel Brooks heard the corn draw in a breath. Daniel had been a farmer long enough to know what the land owed him. Nothing. Land did not owe a man a single sunrise. It didn't owe him rain when he needed it, or mercy when bills came due, or a harvest big enough to outpace the cost of diesel. Land owed only what a man could wrest from it with calluses, timing, and the good graces of a sky that rarely took requests. He told himself that each morning as he laced his boots, as if repeating the creed could inoculate him against disappointment. Most mornings it didn't. He laced them anyway. The Brooks place had been his father's before him and his grandfather's before that. A square of stubborn earth at the edge of Miller County where the wind carried grit and gossip in equal measure. The farmhouse wore its age in chipped paint and a porch that sighed under a man's weight. The barn leaned a degree farther west each year, as if nodding to the storms. It wasn't much to look at. Folks driving by might glance and think, a place that had seen better days. Daniel looked and thought, a place that had seen us through. He kept coffee grounds in a chipped tin and Faith folded like a handkerchief in his back pocket, something to pull out when the day cracked and you needed to dab at the edge of panic. He had a daughter who smiled with her eyes first, because she'd learned early that smiles did more work when they looked like they meant it. Caroline was 16, going on a quiet kind of 30, with a habit of noticing things Daniel missed. The way crows convened 3 days before a cold snap, the hairline in a pipe before it split, the hollow note a fence post made when rot had taken it. She noticed the way silence changed too, which was why, that morning, she woke him. They were alone, the two of them and the dog, since winter. Mary Lou had gone soft in the chest, the doctor said, then hard in the breath. It happened the way storms happen out here, fast when you finally see it, slow when you count back the signs. Daniel kept her quilt folded on the couch like a flag. Sometimes he woke with his face pressed to the pattern without remembering how he got there. Grief had a way of moving him in his sleep. He did not speak of it much. Caroline learned the shapes of the quiet and fit her days around them. The farm accounts were a ledger of hopes and apologies. Seed on credit, repairs delayed, notes from the bank written in that odd, polite tone that said we're reasonable men, and also the doors closing. Richard Collins, who owned the implement dealership and liked to lean too close when he talked, had been sniffing around since April. He'd made a point of saying in the feed store where everyone could hear that a man had to know when to cut loose from a bad field. You can't teach dirt to be better than it is, he'd said, smiling like the comment was a kindness. Daniel put his head down and worked. He sold the South Pasture's old fencing to pay for the corn seed and gambled on a variety the salesman promised could forgive a mistake or two if the weather played fair. The weather did not. But Daniel had wintered before. He told Caroline that tough seasons taught a man to count blessings he'd missed in fat years. He believed it when he said it, most days. Faith was the last thing he held without collateral. He took it to the little white church off Halcyon Road on Sundays, and left it there like a note under a stone. Lord, we are here. Lord, keep us. He did not ask for miracles. He asked for strength to go on if there weren't any. On the morning the lights came, Caroline's voice pulled him from that thin sleep farmers learn, a doze that's only as deep as the next worry. He was moving before his mind filled in the reasons, body already mapping the house, muscle memory of too many midnights spent dousing sparks, chasing coyotes from the hens, beating a storm to the last window. He stepped out into a dawn, smudged with fog, and felt, before he saw anything, that something in the air had tipped, like a room after someone speaks a truth out loud. They crossed the yard in that hush that follows a child's bad dream, when you move soft, so the fear won't get ideas about staying. The cornfield, usually just a shape at that hour, glowed at its edges. Daniel told himself it was the low sun catching dew, but when the first light slipped between rows and did not refract, did not scatter, but held, he knew he was looking at something the sun hadn't made. He wanted it to be a trick. He wanted it to be men from town pulling a prank so he could be angry instead of unmoored. But there were no tire tracks by the ditch. No footprints but theirs. The lights kept their own counsel and their own pace, converging toward that shallow bowl at the field's center where his father had once plowed up an arrowhead and said the earth kept stories if you listened right. Daniel was, by nature, a listener. He crouched, pressed his palm to the soil, and felt that faint humming, not like electricity, like memory. He could almost believe the field remembered something under it and was saying, "Careful now." He told himself he was a fool. He parted the rows anyway. What he found made the word fool fall right out of his mouth and land in the dirt. The circle was too clean to be wind, too precise to be cattle. The bends at the stalk's nodes were crisp and uniform, not snapped, as if heat had persuaded the plants to kneel. In the center, the soil mismatch was subtle, Lighter dust smeared atop darker loam in an oval the size of a trunk lid. A seam, just perceptible, ran its edge. From that seam, a breath of cool light pulsed. He looked back at Caroline. She stood taut, the way a wire hums when plucked, knuckles white around the porch broom she'd grabbed in haste. The dog lay belly flat, chin on paws, eyes tracking the floating lights with the intense suspicion dogs reserve for vacuum cleaners and thunder. "Caroline," Daniel said, and his voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger with his face. "Go fetch the pry bar from the tool shed." She did not move. "What is it?" "I don't know." He tried a smile that didn't find purchase. "Maybe the land finally decided it owes us something." She went, light-footed, vanishing between rows like a deer. Daniel leaned closer to the seam. The hum steadied in his bones. It felt like standing near a big machine when all the parts align. Nothing rattling, only purpose. He knew he should call someone. The sheriff, a neighbor, the bank even. But the morning felt fragile, like a soap bubble in a child's hand. Say the wrong name, and it would burst. "Folks," he imagined a voice on the radio would say, chipper and distant, "if you like stories like this, strange lights, a farmer with more grit than luck, tap that button, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. County road or city high-rise, we're glad you're here." He almost laughed at the thought. Then he realized he did want witnesses. He wanted someone else in the world to see what he and his girl saw, to say later, "We weren't crazy. It happened. It was real." So friend watching this right now, if you're drawn to mysteries that smell like wet corn silk and old earth, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from. Because what came next, what rose from under that seam, would find you again if you didn't give it a name. Caroline returned with the pry bar across her shoulders like a yoke. Daniel took it, slid the flat end along the seam, and felt it catch. The lights hovered close. No heat, only presence. He levered gently. The soil lifted with a damp sigh. Underneath was not rock, not root, not anything a season could make. It was a lid. Metal, old but not rusted. The color of morning steel, inset with a ring. No hinge, only precision. He set his palm on it and felt an answering pulse, as if the thing under the ground had been waiting for a hand. "Daddy?" Caroline said, barely audible. "I know," he answered, though he did not. He hooked the ring and pulled. The lid rose like it had been oiled yesterday. No squeal, no grind, only a soft release, the kind a well-made hatch gives when pressure equalizes. Cool air spilled out, clean as a storm's first breath. It smelled faintly of cedar and something mineral, like river stones turned in a fast current. The pulsing light climbed from the opening, poured itself up without a source and hovered at shoulder height, giving the soil-walled chamber below the color of a dream. Daniel leaned over the mouth. A shaft descended 4 feet, bricked neat, the mortar pale and fine-grained. At the bottom, a second lid, smaller, round, sat embedded in a floor of fitted stone. On its face, etched deep enough to hold shadow, was a pattern of interlocked lines that almost made sense if you stared too long. It was not letters. It was not any map he knew. But the longer he looked, the more he felt that old feeling from math class when an equation balanced, and for a heartbeat, you believed in order. He lowered the pry bar. The tip touched the smaller lid with a speck of chime. The hum in the ground harmonized. He swallowed. "Someone built this," he said. And even as he spoke, he knew he was telling himself a story he could live in. Someone, not something, and not with a tractor. "Like a cellar?" Caroline asked. She had inched closer without meaning to. The lights made gentle room for her, as if folding their glow so she wouldn't squint. "Not like any cellar I've seen." He looked toward the road. The fog had thinned but still muffled distance. If a truck turned down their lane now, he would not hear it until tires met gravel. "Get me the rope," he said, "and the flashlight. The good one." While she ran, Daniel slid his boots against the earth to widen the opening. The stalks at the circle's edge had bent and stayed bent. He realized, with a tilt of his stomach, that if he walked the county for a week, he could not find a single man with a tool to crease green corn like that without breaking it. He pushed the thought aside. There was the matter of what waited 4 feet down, then a lid, then something else. Caroline came back with rope over her shoulder and the flashlight in her teeth, grinning around it because that was how nerves came out in her, bright, defiant. She handed him the light and looped the rope around a stout root that had found the irrigation ditch years ago. Daniel tested the knot, then eased himself into the shaft. The brick was cool and slightly damp. The smell deepened. Cedar and river, and fainter now, a sweetness like late clover. "Hold steady," he said, though she already did. He dropped the last foot and stood in the cramped space, shoulders brushing the walls. The flashlight found the small lid and its etched pattern. Up close, the lines were finer than knife cuts, crisp as if carved this morning. He let the beam travel the circle. No bolts, no hinge, only a thin crescent along one side where stone met metal, and within that hairline, the blackest darkness he had ever seen. "Do we open it?" Caroline's voice came down the rope with a tremor she didn't try to hide. Daniel had never been a man for dramatics. He did not go looking for trouble. He did not invite men like Collins into arguments he couldn't finish. But something about the careful work at his feet, about the patience it took to build a chamber that could wait under a field for who knew how long, called to the part of him that wanted clean answers to messy seasons. He braced the pry bar under the rim. Before he pulled, Scout, who had refused the field a minute ago, began to bark from the yard, sharp and furious. The sound yanked Daniel's head up. Caroline stiffened like a struck string. A truck had turned into the lane, gravel hissing under tires. The fog peeled off its hood in strips. It was a new model, white, with a chrome grille that looked like teeth. Richard Collins drove, shoulders square, smile already loaded on his face. A man sat beside him wearing a cap pulled low and a jacket too heavy for the weather. Daniel's skin went cold. He did not know how Collins knew to come this morning, this minute. Maybe luck. Maybe the world had decided a man with a secret should not have it long. He reached up, squeezed Caroline's calf, a father's code for stay steady, and whispered, "Close the lid. Put the dirt back." "We can't," she whispered back. "It's too—" "Then listen." He pressed the pry bar against the smaller lid and paused, measuring the stride of footsteps in the yard above, the rhythm of Scout's bark, the way the fog gave sound edges. He did not want Collins to find them kneeling over a secret they did not own yet. "If I open this and there's nothing but an old root cellar, we lose a story and gain a laugh. If there's something else—" He did not finish. He didn't need to. Caroline nodded and turned toward the yard, stepping carefully between luminous spheres that rearranged themselves, courteous, as if this too had been planned. Daniel levered. The small lid yielded with a gentle pop. The hum rose. A chord now, hollow and soft. Cold air washed over his hands. He tilted the flashlight. Inside was a box the size of a bread loaf, cradled in a ring of dark wood. The box was luminous in its own way, not bright, but the light seemed to happen near it. Its surface wasn't metal or stone, but something that took the beam and made it tender. Along its edge lay a strip of tarnished brass stamped with words so faint he had to squint and tilt the light. He read 3, property of, and later, Harper and Something Company. The rest had been worn by time or made unreadable on purpose. "Daddy?" Caroline called lower now. "They're here. I see it," Daniel said to the dark and to himself. He slipped the box from its cradle. It was heavier than it looked, the kind of heavy that suggested what was inside mattered, not just to weight, but to history. He tucked it under his shirt, against his belly, and pulled himself up the rope before he could think better. The spheres of light dimmed, either in respect or concern. He reached the surface as tires crunched to a stop by the porch. Collins stepped down, dust flicking off his cuffs. He did not look at the field right away. He looked at the house, at the porch where Mary Lou's quilt lay folded in its corner like a quiet witness. He took off his sunglasses with a small flourish like a man who believed in gestures. "Mornin', Brooks," he called, cheery as a weatherman. "Heard you were up early." Daniel slid the larger lid halfway back into place with the heel of his boot. The light's breath narrowed to a thread. He pasted calm over his face like a piece of masking tape that wouldn't hold. "What can I do for you, Richard?" Collins's smile ticked wider. "Well now, word is county's reviewing delinquent accounts this week. Thought I'd save you the drive. Brought a friend from the bank." The man in the cap lifted 2 fingers from his thigh, eyes hidden. "Be ashamed to waste the day if we're all going to the same place anyhow." Daniel felt the box press cool against his stomach, a second heartbeat under his shirt. The spheres hovered low, their glow softened to what a skeptic could call fog-thick air. Caroline slid to his side, broom abandoned, chin high. "We're a mite busy," Daniel said. Collins finally looked past him to the field. He did not see everything, not yet, but he saw enough. The unusual bend of corn, the turned soil, the way the morning light didn't sit right in that circle. Desire moved over his face like a shadow of cloud. "What do you have there?" "Dirt," Daniel said. "Same as always." Collins laughed politely, the way men laugh at funerals when someone says the deceased would have enjoyed the pie. "Now, Daniel, we're neighbors. Neighbors share. You know how a small thing can make a big difference in hard times. Maybe you finally found your small thing." Daniel tucked the flashlight into his back pocket, wiped his hands on his jeans, and stepped so his boots covered the seam. The hum eased to a low purr, as if the ground knew the script. "Some things," he said, "grow better when they're not fussed with." Collins's eyes cut to Caroline, to the way her pupils were still slightly too wide for the light. He smelled opportunity and stepped forward. Collins didn't ask permission to come off the gravel. He just did, like he always did, like a man who believed property lines were suggestions if he could outsmile a fence post. The man from the bank followed a half step behind, silent, eyes busy. Scout placed himself between the men and Caroline with the solemnity of a veteran, hackles raised but voice gone to low thunder, the kind that warns before it bites. "Easy," Daniel told the dog, and to his daughter under his breath. "Keep your hands free." Collins tipped his chin toward the circle. "Interesting pattern," he said. "Win do that?" "Win's talented lately," Daniel said. "Lucky you," Collins replied, and crouched as if to inspect the bent stalks. He didn't reach out. Maybe he felt the field's charge, that subtle electric hush that asked for respect. Maybe he wanted Daniel to think he did. "County's been talking about sinkholes." He glanced up. "Dangerous things. Swallow a man if he leans wrong." Daniel smiled without showing teeth. "Then best you stand back." Caroline shifted, a half step closer to the seam. She knew what her father was thinking because she was thinking it too. If Collins saw the lid, if he guessed at anything under it, the day would become a different kind of fight. Not about money, about ownership of wonder, and men like Collins believed wonder was a line item. "Let's make this simple," Collins said, standing, dusting imaginary dust. "Times are tight, you've got notes coming due. My friend here would love to help. Structure, refinance, call it what you will. Might even be I could throw in a sweetener from the dealership. We keep each other afloat like neighbors." "What's the rate for drowning slower?" Daniel asked. Collins chuckled. "You used to be funnier." Caroline spoke up, voice steady. "You used to be kinder." A small pause. Collins looked at her properly for the first time. "Miss Brooks, you make a good case for manners." His eyes slid back to the circle. "But manners don't pay the co-op." The bankman cleared his throat, the first sound he'd made. "Mr. Brooks," he said, voice dry as paper, "we do need some clarity on your intent. This morning." The box under Daniel's shirt felt like a brand. He resisted the urge to touch it. He'd made the mistake once of looking guilty because he felt guilty about something that wasn't a crime. Surviving, mostly. He laced his fingers together in front of him, forearms loose, and let the silence stretch until it felt like choice. "My intent," he said at last, "is to harvest a field and keep a roof over my daughter's head." Collins smiled like he'd win either way. "Then let's see what you've got growing here." He took a step toward the seam. Daniel moved without thinking. He slid his boot, planted, and met Collins's advance with the polite, immovable pressure you give a man whose hand lingers too long in a handshake. For a second, they were two boys at a barn door again, testing weight. Collins's smile wilted. He was not used to being the one who yielded. "Richard," Daniel said, soft but shaped, "if this is a sinkhole, you're standing too close. If it's not, you're standing even closer to trouble." Collins looked past him, calculation flicking. He could call the sheriff. He could make a case that a debtor was concealing assets. Absurd, but men had built worse cases with thinner air. He weighed how much time a morning held. He settled on a tactic that had served him in showrooms and backrooms alike. Make the other man feel small. "I'll give you an hour," he said, checking a watch too shiny for farm country. "Then I'm coming back with folks who can make decisions you won't like. Maybe the county, maybe the state, maybe someone who wears letters on a jacket. Kind of folks who bring cameras," the bankman added, not quite apologetic. Caroline's hand found her father's. She squeezed once. He felt the years in that squeeze. Baby, girl, almost woman, and something inside him leveled. "An hour," he agreed. "And when you return, Richard, bring a decent cup of coffee. Yours is always better than mine." Collins blinked, thrown off rhythm. Then he laughed as if this too had been his idea. "Deal." He tilted his head toward the porch. "Shame about Mary Lou's roses." He said it lightly, but he watched for flinch. Daniel did not give him one. Collins and the bankman retreated to the truck. Gravel spit under tires. The engine noise folded into the morning and left the field louder in its absence. They listened to the silence for a count of 10, then 20. When the truck's growl was only memory, Daniel exhaled. "We have 45 minutes, he said. Maybe less. Help me." They slid the larger lid back. The breath of light welcomed them like a librarian who had expected them at 9 sharp. Daniel dropped to the chamber again and lifted the smaller hatch. The box sat in his hands a moment later, heavier for having a future attached. They carried it to the barn, where the light could be made their own. Inside, dust hung in beams, and the air smelled of hay and oil. Daniel set the box on Mary Lou's old potting bench, a sturdy plank that had held seedlings, broken handles, and wakeful midnight conversations. He thumbed the brass strip again, coaxing words from tarnish. Property of Harper, and he thought of Edward Harper, the county sheriff, genial as a porch swing, a man whose family name ran through the church registry like thread. Could it be his people? Or another Harper, long gone? What if it's valuable? Caroline asked. What if it's nothing? Then we'll know which story we're telling, Daniel said. The box had no lock to pick, no hinge to coax. On its underside, his fingers found 4 small depressions, spaced like the corners of a childhood game. He pressed them, one by one. The box clicked softly. A heartbeat caught, and the top slid an inch. He lifted it. Inside lay papers, wrapped in waxed cloth that kept time from eating them outright. Beneath the cloth, a notebook bound in cracked leather. A compass with a needle that did not settle but pointed insistent toward the house, as if the house were north. A coil of thin copper wire, and beneath those, nested in a slit of velvet, a key. The key was odd. Its teeth were notched in a pattern that looked almost like the etching on the small lid, interlocks arranged with the grace of intention. The metal was the same morning steel color as the hatch. When Daniel held it, the hair on his arms rose again. Not fear now, but kinship, like shaking hands with a distant cousin you recognize without being told. Caroline lifted the notebook with reverence. The first page bore a name in ink browned by time. Philip Harper. Below it, a date, June 12th, 1919. The handwriting was neat and unromantic, a working man's letters. If you're reading this, the first line began, "Then you found what we built where the field dips." What we built, Caroline read, whispering. We. They paged through. Sketches of the field, the dip, measurements, notes about soil conductivity after storms, a map that charted points around the property with symbols that matched the notebook's margin marks, small circles, triangles, a star. In the middle of the map where their barn sat now, a rectangle shaded darker than the rest, labeled simply, room. Daniel and Caroline looked at each other. A secret room, she said. Or a generator, Daniel said, eyeing the copper wire. He remembered stories of boys in the county cranking radios from scraps, pulling music from the air. He traced the key's pattern with his thumb. The notebook had a page dog-eared near the back. He turned to it. The heading read, On Use and Ownership. The paragraph beneath it was brief. This is not a thing to be sold. It is a thing to be kept in stewardship. It belongs to the land, and the land to God, and the hands that tend both. If you take it for profit, it will not work. If you use it for keeping, it will keep you. Carolyn let out a breath that wavered. Daddy, he closed the notebook gently. We don't have time to argue with ghosts about ethics, he said, but the words had already threaded into him like a stitch. He picked up the compass, watched the needle tug toward the house again, then toward the field, then finally settle. No, not settle, choose, and point toward the far stall where Mary Lou had once kept tomato steaks. They moved the stakes. Behind them, the old wood slats of the stall wall revealed a seam Daniel had never bothered to notice, a hairline where 2 boards met too perfectly. He pressed. The panel shifted, then slid, revealing a narrow passage faintly lined in the same pale mortar as the field shaft. The air beyond smelled like cedar and electricity after rain. They stared a beat that stretched into 2. Then Daniel put a hand to the low doorframe and ducked inside. The passage swallowed them in a hush like a library under the earth. Brick walls, low ceiling, the copper tang of old electricity. At the end, a rectangular room opened. Shelves with labeled jars, coils, ceramic insulators, a work table blanketed by canvas, a socket cut to the exact silhouette of the strange key. Daniel set the breadbox chest down. The compass needle swung and parked on the socket like a bird finding north. Caroline thumbed Philip Harper's notebook to the page marked room. Field battery under God's sky. Accumulator beneath God's roof, she read. One gathers. One gives. Gives what? Power, she said, and the word seemed bigger than the room. Tires chewed gravel above. Fast. Official. Voices. Collins hadn't wasted the hour. He'd multiplied it. Daniel met his daughter's eyes. Quick. He slid the key into the socket. It fit as if the machine had been waiting. A breath. Coils woke, humming higher than the field's low throb. Ceiling lamps guttered to life, spilling a tender daylight. Caroline's laugh popped free, the kind that arrives when hope does. A lever waited beside a wound drum. Harper's neat warning. Spin slow first. Let the battery meet the field. Never force what will give freely. Daniel nudged the lever. The drum turned. The hum deepened. Beneath their boots, the earth returned a note. Two instruments meeting after a long silence and agreeing on a key. Boots hit the porch. A fist battered the door. County Sheriff's Office, Mr. Brooks, open up. Daniel froze. Caroline did not. There's a second switch, she said, tracing margin notes. Hidden plate. For times when our keep must be kept. Her fingers found a seam under the bench. A panel slid, revealing porcelain knobs labeled barn, house, field, perimeter, and one unlabeled, set apart like a secret inside the secret. Perimeter, Daniel said. She turned the knob. Above, Scout barked once and fell uncertainly silent. The shouting dulled, wrapped in wool. Even the air at the fence line felt thicker, as if wind had to ask permission. Mr. Brooks, a calmer voice called through the boards. Don't make me force entry. Collins' syrup followed. Ed, the debtor's hiding assets. There's a dangerous structure. Daniel exhaled, flipped the unlabeled switch. The room brightened, steadied. Out in the field, the pale spheres rose and took posts at four corners like quiet watchmen. The front door rattled, then stilled. Mr. Collins, step back, the sheriff said, authority shaped by something like respect. A pause. I can feel something. This is not a showroom. Daniel climbed up, slid the stall panel shut, and stepped into the barn's cool shadow. He walked out with empty hands. Sheriff Edward Harper stood 10 feet off, hat in his hands, eyes on Daniel's face instead of the field. Collins loitered with a bank man and two uneasy deputies. Morning, Harper said. Morning, Daniel returned. We got a complaint, Harper went on, and 3 separate calls about lights over this county at dawn. His gaze shifted to the circle. Bent stalks not broken, the patched seam. Something like recognition passed across his features. Lower, for Daniel alone. My great-granddad wrote letters about a keeper on this land. If it's what I think, it's a thing to be kept, not sold. It still works, Daniel said. Collins laughed too loud. Works. Gentlemen, a debtor claiming proprietary rights to a phenomenon he can't explain. Richard, Harper said without looking at him, ditch the sales pitch. A gull cut across the property line, flared, and veered as if hitting an invisible wall of water. Even Collins stopped pretending. Caroline stepped to her father's shoulder. We can't keep everyone out forever, she said, steady. But we can decide who we let in and why. Harper heard and nodded once. What do you need from me, Mr. Brooks? Daniel could have said money or muscle. Pride tempted him toward silence. He chose what the notebook asked. Stewardship, a line in a book that recognizes this as appurtenant to the land and the hands that tend it. We'll show you what it does. You write down that it isn't to be sold. Collins went the color of bad sunburn. You can't be serious. I am, Harper said. He lifted a hand. The deputies stepped back. Bring me a crime, Mr. Collins, and a warrant that names it. Trespass won't be on us. Collins edged toward the field, then stopped when the air at the boundary quietly insisted. He turned fury toward Daniel because fury needs a face. You think this makes you untouchable? Debt is math, not magic. Then you'll appreciate this, Daniel said, surprising himself. He tossed Collins the keys to his old pickup, the parts truck Collins had coveted since winter. Apply it on my account. The rest I'll pay by harvest. Show me, Harper said simply. Daniel led him to the barn. Hat off, the sheriff held it like a hymn book. They slid the panel. The passage breathed cedar and clean air. In the room below, lamps glowed steady. Harper stood a long moment without speaking, which told Daniel blood remembers what it builds. Readings, pages, the line on use and ownership. Stubborn old men, Harper said. I come from a line of them. You and me both, Daniel said. They surfaced. Collins paced lines in the yard like a fox at a fence. He saw the sheriff's face and read the answer. He spat and climbed in his white truck. This isn't over, he said, because men like him need the last line. It is for today, Harper answered. That's enough. The trucks rolled away, dust settling. The deputies left with glances that said they'd tell only the boring parts. The hum eased to a companionable purr. The spheres sank and dimmed like banked coals. Caroline turned the perimeter knob down to listening, not wall. They stood in the quiet that arrives after a storm changes its mind. We still owe, Caroline said, pragmatic as the ledger. We do, Daniel said, but for the first time since winter, we've got terms that aren't written by other men. She let out a breath. And a light that belongs to us. He squeezed her shoulder. We did not pick this storm, but we learned to steer in it. Above, the sky went blue. Somewhere on the highway, a driver would swear he had seen the air itself hold its ground and then decide to let him pass. Somewhere, a skeptic would call it inversion, and maybe he'd be right. Here, in the field's dip, a farmer and his girl listened to a machine and a soil agree on how to sing, and called it what Philip Harper had named it 100 years ago. Keeping. Truly. Word of the morning traveled the county the way truth does here, quietly through feed stores and church steps, over fence lines and pickup beds. Brooks has something, men said. Women said, leave him be. Sheriff Harper filed a note that wasn't quite a report so much as a promise. Historical infrastructure under private stewardship, county assistance upon request. The phrase made Collins grind his teeth. For 3 days the perimeter hummed politely, discouraging the curious, calming the dogs. Daniel and Caroline read Philip's notebook until they could quote it. They found 2 more shallow plugs and left them closed. Stewardship begins with restraint. They tuned the room like an instrument with strings older than they were. At night, the accumulator fed the house and a hidden line to the yard. The kitchen lights returned without the meter running like a stopwatch on their dignity. The pump drew water cold enough to sting teeth. On the 4th day, the barn radio coughed, pulled a hymn from static, and filled the rafters with voices Mary Lou had loved. They did math, yield, diesel, time. If the machine kept the house, ran the pump, charged tools, and quietly sold a little power to Owen Tate's milking parlor without turning the farm into a carnival, the notes could be met. Not overnight. Over months, shaped by work and luck. Old partners. Harper came evenings, not in uniform. He brought good coffee and a file of Philip Harper's letters. One line was underlined twice. We made a light that doesn't ask permission from men who sell it. Harper read, glanced at the glowing lamps, and tucked the page away like a relic. Universities will want pieces, he warned. Investors, men with jackets and letters. They can want, Daniel said. Collins tried twice more. Once with a county inspector who stepped past the line, felt a tug in his teeth, and left fast. Once with a state man devoted to paperwork. He left a grant brochure and a business card. Caroline pinned both to a nail for maybe later. On Saturday, the church ladies came with pies and the unspoken clause, "We're here to feed, not pry." They set apple and chess on the table beside the ledger. Caroline put out plates. Velma Brooks, no kin, only name, pressed Daniel's hand. Mary Lou would have grinned herself inside out to see light in that kitchen. He nodded. Some victories are quiet. Harvest came honest. The bent stalk circle made a path for loads without rutting the whole place. The yield wasn't miraculous. It was respectable. Respectable was enough. The bank took 3 payments on time. Collins took the old pickup for parts and stopped looking at the house. Near frost, they opened the plug behind the silo. Tools wrapped in oilcloth. A tin of dried seeds labeled for lean years. They closed it again. The north plug held a ledger and a folded deed rider. Language tying the accumulator and room to stewardship, not sale. Harper photographed it for the county, then tucked it back. Not everything belongs in a museum. Winter arrived with its honest work. The machine purred. The house stayed warm. Caroline studied physics at the kitchen table, asked questions that made Daniel laugh, and then think hard. "You gonna leave me for a university?" he teased. "Not if they make me choose between labs and mornings like this," she said, and meant both in the huge way daughters do. At Advent, Daniel turned the field knob and let the spheres drift at dusk. Cars lined the road. People stayed in their cars and watched. In the barn, beneath lamps that didn't flicker, Daniel read Philip's line, "If you use it for keeping, it will keep you." He closed the book and touched Mary Lou's quilt. He kept promises, paid, fixed what broke, accepted one grant that didn't ask for ownership, refused 3 that did. Harper wrote a line in a county book that threaded stewardship into law. When reporters finally came, late for spectacle, they found a farmer, a daughter, and a humming key. On a night of sideways snow, Daniel stood at the field's dip. The lights were banked like coals. He pressed his palm to the seam. He didn't ask the land for anything. He said thank you. He felt an answer in his bones, low and sure, like a choir warming up. Then he went in, pulled the kitchen chain, click, and told the friend watching now. Outside, the wind settled over the rows for good. If this story found you, let it keep you. Tap subscribe, tell us where you're watching from, and then go stand in whatever field you've got, yard, rooftop, city stoop, and listen. If you use what's been given to you for keeping, it will keep you. That's the promise. That's the work. That's the light.